Well, good morning, everyone. I see some familiar faces from last night, which was a lot of fun, having all of our grantees together from Evidence for Action. And for those who weren't with us last night, welcome. It's wonderful to see so many of you with us in person. And for those who are live streaming, we are glad that you're joining us as well. My name is Amani Nuru-Jeter. I'm the Director of Evidence for Action. And on behalf of Evidence for Action, again, I want to welcome you all to this symposium. So briefly, for those who are less familiar with Evidence for Action, or what we call E4A, E4A is a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And our goal, our mission, is to really advance and align with the foundation's goals to advance action-oriented health equity research. As an organization, we fund participatory and action-oriented health equity research using an approach that is intentionally anti-racist and anti-colonial and really focused on systems-level solutions. So we're really excited about just all of you being here, all of our grantees who are really moving the needle way more upstream and really thinking about not only what are the causes, the root and fundamental causes of racial and indigenous and other forms of health inequities, but more importantly, how do we start to devise solutions to those root causes, right? So that we can kind of move the needle and advance health equity. Just to take a brief moment to contextualize this meeting within the entire Ways of Knowing Symposia series, it's actually hard to believe that we're here at the 5th and culminating event of our series. This has been a 5-part series starting in March with our kickoff event at the Celia Weatherhead at the Tulane University Celia Weatherhead School of Tropical Medicine and Public Health. Was that right? Okay. Well, we had a wonderful time at our kickoff event in New Orleans, followed by 3 topic-focused symposia. The first on Indigenous ways of knowing in Montana, the second on transforming community-led research in Greenville, North Carolina, and then the last one, which was just, I think, a month ago, on redefining rigor in the health sciences in Washington, D.C. And then here we are at our culminating event. What's important in terms of ways of knowing, the point and the goal of this series is to really push the foundation's interest in pushing back against that, what they're calling the health science knowledge system. So really thinking about a much more holistic way of thinking about what knowledge is, how is knowledge created, what and whose knowledge is traditionally valued and disseminated, and how do we push back against what have been very traditional ways of thinking about knowledge, generation of knowledge, and really thinking about all of the different knowledge, all of the different ways that we create knowledge, and using that for a fuller understanding of health inequities and what we need to advance health equity. So that's what we're all gathered here for today. And we kind of like to think about these symposia as almost town hall gatherings where we're really trying to crowdsource your insights, your ideas, your experiences, so that we can actually create an action plan, which is where we hope we end at the end of our time together. So we have, over the course of the last 4 events, been generating information from all of our participants and these amazing ideas about pushing back against the health science knowledge system. And as you may know, if you've read through the participant guide, we have a preliminary set of themes that have emerged across these different sessions. Our goal for today is to get your participation to help refine and hone those themes so that we can then create an action plan that we're going to use and take into our next year of activities, which is to really try to both seed as in plant, but also give over the leadership of this. We see our role as really convening experts, and we hope to convene gatekeepers that are really better positioned to action on the themes that we are developing here. So we are super excited. We have a wonderful day planned for you. Again, on behalf of Evidence for Action, welcome. And I will turn it, and one more thing, you will hear from the panel that we have next will include participants from our various series. So really looking forward to that. And with that, I'll end and turn it over to Dr. Thomas LaVeist. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Amani, and good morning, everyone. So my name is, good morning, everyone. Come on. Like, I know we're not in church, right? But if I call, you do what? I asked this, so you know what you're supposed to do. Okay, good. So we got that. Let's bring a little life to this. All right, thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Levis, and let's help out with good morning, and let's help out with the title. So I am Dean, and I am the Weatherhead Presidential Chair in Health Equity at the Tulane University Celia Scott Weatherhead School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And yes, we do say all 10 words. But I'm here today as PI of Partners for Advancing Health Equity, which is a Rob Wood Johnson funded initiative to bring together people from multiple sectors of society who are all working on various aspects of health equity. When we talk about sectors, we're talking about government, academia, of course, civil society or community. We're talking about the private sector as well, all of which are entities that are taking actions to try to affect health equity in some way. And what we want to do is bring people together so that we can be more synergistic in deploying resources in the most effective way. So we do that through convenings that we host, conferences, symposiums, workshops, town hall meetings of that type. The Ways of Knowing Symposium series aligns with our core mission to do that work. It harmonizes solutions and moves towards more equitable systems of knowledge. As a convener, we hope to continue making space for these conversations as we work to prioritize the emerging themes and build on this action plan that Amani has mentioned. So we're thrilled to be hosting or co-hosting this culminating event alongside Race Forward's Facing Health Conference here in St. Louis. And to learn more about the event as a whole, I turn it over to Jacoa Lape, who is Senior Director of Impact Evaluation and Learning and Research at Race Forward.
Good morning, everybody. It's definitely good to see some familiar faces and also see some new faces. I am newly minted Dr. Jaboa Lake. Thank you. So as of last week, so I got to say it to make it real. But I'm the Senior Director of Impact Evaluation, Learning and Research at Race Forward, and very much welcome to Facing Race Conference. I know not everyone can stay for the whole conference. You're missing out, I'm sorry. But that's just the truth of it all. But you can already see, so much art and culture and liveliness and organizing and folks who are really leading with their values in this work. And there's going to be 4,000 of us here in just another like 24 hours. So it's a really rich group, and I'm excited for you all to be in community. I am going to talk pretty fast because I have another session that I'm going to, but it is what it is. But I do want to make sure we're doing a little bit of placemaking about why St. Louis, why here, what is important. If we're really thinking about our values as researchers and as practitioners about decolonizing the ways that we do our work, being critical about the ways that we do our work, we need to make sure that we're not disentangling, even gathering together from the places that we're in, from the histories that have happened here, and from the futures that are going to happen in all of the places we choose to be. Within Race Forward, just to let you all know, like we really try to lead with our values in convening spaces. So we have community benefits agreements with every location that we have a conference in. We've been working for almost 2 years with organizers here in St. Louis to build relationships, to be in right relationship. You'll see some of that throughout the hall, whether that's art from local artists, photography from local folks, familiar names in the organizing spaces that I'm sure that you will recognize, and then a huge like vendor and art market that highlights local artists, local vendors. It is about to be holiday season, so if you need some gifts for folks, then I very much encourage you to go to the vendor market. But that'll show up throughout this space here, and we hope that you feel the types of principles that we led with as we organize this whole convening. So just some placemaking in St. Louis, and I do have my notes, so I'm going to hold my laptop just to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. It's pretty common now to see land acknowledgements, but we do want to go beyond that and to really not just recognize land, but also recognize labor and recognize resistance that has happened here in St. Louis. So I'll be talking a little bit about that. So first of all, we are on Indigenous land. This is a settled colonial state, and we need to recognize that this is not what this place has always been. So we are on the lands of the Osage-Nasage, the Atto Missouria, Illinois Confederacy, Quapaw, Ho-Chunk, and Miami, along with many other tribal people who have made their way through this land in different ways. So we always encourage folks to go to Native Land website to see where they're at whenever they travel anywhere, whose land they're on. But you're also welcome to go to that website if you'd like to learn anything about any of the tribes that the tribal lands that we're on, the calls to actions that they might have on their websites, community resources that they might have on their websites also. So it's not just about recognizing the land, but also recognizing that people are still here and they still need action taken to them too. So there's that. I also do want to recognize that we are in actually a really cool space. Not a ton of people know about the Cahokia Mounds. We're about 8 miles away here in St. Louis from one of the largest cities that existed pre-Columbian times. So about 8 miles, you can see in the red square from St. Louis are the Cahokia Mines, and it's a historical World Heritage Site, and it was one of the largest, pre-Columbian sites north of Mexico. Had its peak around 1100. It stretched over 4,000 acres and had over 20,000 people, potentially more. There aren't a ton of records, but we know that there were tens of thousands of people. So at the time, it was larger than London. So it was a really huge metropolis, and we're right next to it. There are hundreds of mounds, and these were land that was manipulated to host people and to build out the city. So you can actually go and visit these mounds. If people do have a minute while they're here in St. Louis or they're coming back, very much encourage folks to go to the mounds and see the space. There are some cultural centers and things like that on site, but just recognizing that it was such a vast space. We are in the middle of a metropolis, and that this city isn't the first city that has been here. We also do want to recognize the theft of Indigenous lands. And here in Missouri is no different, but Missouri is also different because it is along the Trail of Tears. So though we recognize Indigenous folks who have been here for tens of thousands, maybe even longer years, then that we also recognize that there was a lot of forced movement that happened. So Missouri being along the Trail of Tears is something that we need to recognize too, because folks who are here, who are Indigenous and find home here, it wasn't always their original home, and that displacement took a lot away from folks. And so recognizing that the theft of land wasn't just about taking land, but it was the forced removal of people in very violent ways, and that Missouri here is not exempt from that. So this land has been traveled by so many different types of people with so many different types of stories, whether that was forcibly or selectively, and that's something to recognize here in Missouri also. But Missouri also has a deep Black history. St. Louis is a Black city. It is rich in Black culture. It is rich in Black history. It is proud to be a Black city too. And that's something that as we've worked with local organizers, has become very apparent. People are very proud to be a part of Black St. Louis. But St. Louis has a really, complicated history with Blackness and with how it's held Blackness within the city. And like most places, it has a history of enslavement, and not just of enslavement through, let me make sure I'm getting my dates right. So, enslavement in Missouri predated statehood. So as far as 1720, there are records of enslavement here in Missouri, even when Missouri was a Spanish colony. And a lot of the industries that forced enslavement were things like working in the mines. That was the initial industry, but also industries such as cotton, tobacco, hemp, grain, and livestock. So these were the industries that built Missouri off of stolen people and stolen labor. But what really set St. Louis specifically apart was that it was an auction city. So there are places around the city that were very, very busy auction blocks. And that is something that still seeps into how people navigate this space, the trauma in certain spaces in St. Louis, and the repair that a lot of organizers in St. Louis that are working on the reparations commission are holding close to them too. So it's about this, this history of enslavement, but we have always freed ourselves. So St. Louis also has many sites that were associated with the Underground Railroad. So this map shows sites around St. Louis that are along the Underground Railroad. So it's not just about what happened to us, but also the resistance that we led with and the ways that we built freedom for ourselves, even before emancipation. And, just as importantly, this 2024 is the 10-year anniversary of the Ferguson Uprising, which is one of the more significant pieces of why we're here in St. Louis and why it's important to bring racial justice practitioners, organizers, people who practice in this space to this space and be in community with St. Louis. We all saw what happened, and we all continue to see similar things happen after Ferguson. But there has been so much that has been learned in the last 10 years around organizing, around how to hold grief, around how to hold injustice, that the nation and the world has really learned from. We see solidarity with Ferguson internationally. So it was such a significant, as folks say, it's not a moment, it's a movement. It's such a significant movement. And to recognize that that is something that has built the culture of St. Louis and continues to build the culture of St. Louis is something that we really, respect, but also it's very, at least for myself, I feel a lot of honor being able to be in this space and to be in community with folks who have engaged for the last 10 years in this way in St. Louis. Michael Brown Sr. is present at Facing Race, and he'll be at some of the plenaries, but one of his quotes about his son is that it ain't over, it's just the beginning. So you'll see folks who this is not just a place, but this is a deeply personal event, and having them welcome Facing Race and you all here is, I think, quite a big deal, so I hope that you, hold that close to you and that know that you're in community, you're in with folks who are action oriented, and that you're here to be supported in the ways that you continue the movement, because again, it's just the beginning. And then there is a documentary that came out that's called Ferguson 10 Years Later. It's about half an hour long. Definitely encourage folks to check that out afterwards too, if you'd like to hear a little bit more about the history of organizing. And then lastly, I just wanted to uplift our host committee. So as I said, Facing Race and Race Forward really try to lead with our values in the ways that we're in space together. So not only about, recognizing why St. Louis is an important place to be and all of the history and the future that people are building for St. Louis, but recognizing the people that make it this way too. So we have a host committee, and you can check the Facing Race website for all of the details about who's on the host committee, our community benefits agreements, all of the actions that are being taken here in St. Louis. But we very much, are thankful to the host committee for allowing thousands of people to come into their city, to come into their space, and to be in relationship with them. So I encourage you all to check out the Facing Race website and look at the host committee and the work that they're doing here in St. Louis. Specifically, some of the local actions, as I've been talking to a lot of organizers and working with them for the last couple of years too, is around issues of criminalization, issues around reparations, issues around policing, and also issues around health. So specifically maternal and mental health are really big issues here in St. Louis, but also environmental justice. There's a lot of environmental racism that's been going on in this area that have been making folks sick for a long time, that folks are trying to organize around too. So learning about what's going on here and who's organizing it and why is something I encourage you all to do. And I think that's my time. Thank you. I'll see y'all later.
Good morning, everyone. I can't see you, but hopefully you can see me, and I think you can hear me now. I'm Claire Gibbons, Senior Program Officer in the Research Evaluation and Learning Department at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I am really sorry that I can't be there in person today. I had certainly intended to be, but life happens sometimes. But it's great to be able to join virtually, and this is one of the times where I'm super thankful for Zoom. So I wanted to start just by thanking our amazing co-hosts, so Jaboa Lake that you just heard from, and others at Race Forward for so generously sharing the space that you all are at in person for this closing session, and for partnering on planning this day. There really couldn't be a better time to partner with the Facing Race Conference. And I want to thank all of the folks from the Evidence for Action program and Partners for Advancing Health Equity for their vision and leadership for this series. Takes a lot of work to plan and support one meeting. And they've done 5 in 5 different states in 1 year, and that's pretty incredible. So I just want to thank them by name too, because there's a bunch of folks. Erin Hagan, Natalie DeRocca, Lucinda Benjamin, Steph Chernitsky, Amani Nuru-Jeter, Kristen Poitra, Greta Kappelman, Omar Dewari, and Thomas Leviste. The deep partnership across programs among this group has been so satisfying and fulfilling, and I just appreciate each of you so much for your work on the Symposia series this year. And I also want to thank our co-organizers who willingly took on a lead role in each of these symposia and who had such a profound impact on each meeting. Your work has had a deep impact on me personally and professionally. And of course, not just on me, but on all the participants in each of these meetings and the people who heard about the meetings from those of us who participated, and those who are going to read about the learnings from these meetings in future writings and talks and through the action agenda, et cetera. So let me thank those folks by name too. So those include Joseph Gahn, Melissa Walls, Joey Williams, Charisse Iglesias, Paige Castor-Reyes, Kanga Denzanpa, Melody Goodman, Bert Chantarat, Adolfo Cuevas, and Jaboa Lake. So before I go on, let me take a moment to just acknowledge what's on everyone's mind. We're going to have a new administration in the White House, and we're all bracing for the impact of that. It's a difficult time. And really one of the most important times for us to be doing this work. RWJF hasn't really been front and center in these meetings on purpose, but I did think you might appreciate knowing that the foundation remains steadfast in its commitment to health, to evidence, and to health equity. Our president and CEO, Rich Besser, and others at the foundation are speaking out widely about the threats to the dignity and humanity and well-being of all people in the United States that this new administration brings. So if you've seen anything that he's written or heard him speaking recently, you know he's not pulling any punches about the devastating effect the new administration could have if they continue to center themselves in politics rather than the health of the people of this country. So let me especially emphasize that RWJF is more committed than ever to its work on health equity and our efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. As Rich has said recently, that commitment includes bolstering our work around diversity, equity, inclusion, reproductive justice, and access to affordable healthcare that treats everyone with dignity. And we're not going to waver from these priorities, which include advancing policymaking specifically designed to repair and combat our country's legacy of racial discrimination and oppression. We'll continue to respond to the attacks on DEI efforts with resources and supports to grantees, policymakers, and other philanthropies. And we know you all are doing the same, standing firm and holding to our values and your values. Your work and your voices are more important than ever. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to thank each of the planners and co-hosts of these series by name, just to demonstrate, look, there's 20 people who've been spending quite a bit of time over the last year planning these meetings, who are committed to this work. Each of those folks have full-time jobs or more than full-time jobs, and they really didn't need probably more work, but they essentially volunteered to do this work with us. So I just want you to see and feel the partnership and solidarity that you have with the others who are in the room and on screen today. So take a look around, scroll through your screen, and see all the allies that you have with each other. So let's celebrate that a little bit today and enjoy the time that we have. And I think I'm just echoing Jaboa. So just enjoy, if you're staying for Facing Race, enjoy those 4,000 people, right? You've got something in common with them. So over the last 5 years, RWJF has deepened in our approximately 5 years, RWJF has deepened and expanded our focus on structural and systemic barriers to health. And much of our work is now explicitly focused on dismantling structural racism. And that focus on equity, as Amani said, naturally leads us to thinking more about how evidence is created. Who's creating the knowledge? Why is it being created? Where is it disseminated? Who has access to it? And what difference is that work going to make? These aren't new questions for many in the field. They aren't new questions for you. They are a little bit new questions for RWJF in our research department. But this focus on equity requires that we recognize the current and historic practices of what we're calling the health science knowledge system. I honestly don't know if anyone else uses that phrase, but that's what we're calling it. And we're just recognizing that there is obviously an underrepresentation of people of color leading or participating in research. gatekeeping of knowledge through limited access to academic journals and other sources of knowledge dissemination. We have knowledge production that's disconnected from policy, systems change, and action. A lack of diversity in and support for health services research, public health research, health policy research, and as well as other topics, fields as well. We have research that's disconnected from the needs and voices of communities, particularly communities of color. And we have very strict and exclusive concepts of what constitutes data and evidence. So RWJF is thinking about a series of steps to help support transformation in the system. We're not the NIH, we're a large foundation, but small in the scheme of things, but we can fund some work that can catalyze action. And sometimes our work can influence NIH as well. So these strategies really focus on 6 different areas, including constructing equitable community data that supports action, centering equity in research methods and data analysis, building and promoting inclusion in research and knowledge production practices, transforming health sciences and knowledge institutions to advance equity, ensuring equity through evidence dissemination, and strengthening community knowledge. So I know all of this sounds familiar to you because it relates to the conversations we've been having during this series. And now you see the connection. These meetings, the action agenda that's arising from these meetings is directly informing our work. And of course, not just RWJF's work, but those in philanthropy and other actors in the United States and actually even abroad. There's a groundswell of excitement and interest and motivation to shift how we think about knowledge and creating knowledge. So thank you for joining this effort, for bringing your ideas and experiences, for shaping this work, for leading this work, and for all of the work that you're doing and for these conversations we're about to have. And now I want to turn this over to my colleague, Fiona Kanaga-Singham, who is the Vice President of the Equity and Culture Department at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Fiona joined RWJF in 2022 as the first VP of Equity and Culture. She's a key member of the Foundation's leadership team and is responsible for internally advancing RWJF's mission and vision by building the strategy for and operationalizing equity, diversity, and inclusion foundation-wide. She hasn't been at the foundation that long, but she has had an incredible impact already, and I'm thrilled that she's joined the foundation and have been affected by her and seen the impact of her work. So thrilled to invite her up today. And I just want to say too that we invited Fiona to speak because one of the things that's been highlighted throughout this series is the importance of internal institutional change. And we really couldn't think of a better person to speak with us about how that institutional change can happen and to tell us about her efforts at helping RWJF to shift to become a liberated, anti-racist, anti-colonial organization. So Fiona, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire. Can you hear me at the back? Oh, I see. Louder. Is this better? Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's really wonderful to be with you. And, I think Claire sort of alluded to my role and sort of place in this conversation. I was telling Amani yesterday when I was able to drop by the wonderful reception at the Botanical Gardens that I feel like I'm crashing a party. For one, when Claire asked me to join you all, I think my question was, well, why and how can I be helpful? For one, I am not a researcher, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, and two, I'm new to this community as well. And I say this because I think it is really important to situate ourselves in any conversation, in any institution, in any community when we do this work. And so I often describe my work as the work of institutional transformation. Sometimes I talk about it as equity transformation, which I see as my life's work. And what I mean by that is really about helping institutions develop the analysis, ways of knowing and seeing the analysis, the will, and the skills to leverage all of our resources in the service of equity and justice, right? And so that is my role at RWJF. We have made a public commitment, which is an evolving process for us. We have made a public commitment to build a multicultural, anti-racist, I should add anti-colonial philanthropy that leverages all of our assets to advance health equity and justice. And so with that said, I want to say that I am so honored to be in conversation and in community with you all today. One, I think in our shared work to advance racial and indigenous equity and justice, but also to be in dialogue about the ways in which institutional transformation and ways of knowing interact with each other. I know that that has been a theme of an anchoring theme of the work that you all have done together. Yesterday, Amani, I was listening to your comments. I was listening very, very closely. And, you talked as well about how the foundation's work to more explicitly address structural racism was an important reason that you felt like this could be a home for you. And I think as many of you who have been with the foundation been partners to the foundation for some time know, this was not always the case, right? It's a very recent stance and practice, this explicit commitment to addressing structural racism. For a long time, we didn't, and even grantees now will tell me that, just a few years ago, they sat in rooms where the foundation said we cannot talk about racism because it is too risky, it's too partisan. And there are other issues. I mean, I could add to that list our stance on abortion, gun control. A lot of these issues are fairly new, right, to how the foundation shows up in our work. Even the more expansive view of health beyond beyond medical and healthcare systems alone, like that has been an evolution for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And all of these changes didn't happen by chance, right? The foundation has had to evolve and had to tend to the conditions, the culture, the container within which we do this work, so that how we show up external. You can hear me okay? So that how we show up externally is different, looks different, and actually has a different impact. And so for all of you who are doing bold and challenging equity-focused work within your institutional settings, you know that doing this often means doing this against the grain, right, from the inside. It means often listening to, valuing sources of expertise and wisdom that have been historically excluded. It means pushing up against structures, incentive structures, cultural norms within your own institution about what is actually valued and seen as success. And it also means very often we are doing this work as individuals in institutions that we might not even feel a deep sense of belonging in, but we have to do this work on behalf of the institution anyway. And so when I talk about, and Claire again alluded to, our own commitment to transform ourselves in order for us to be the philanthropy that we say we want to be, and in order to move the needle on health equity and justice, this by definition has meant that our external work and internal work are inseparable. And it also means that it requires transformation. We're not there yet. Even though the foundation has made good progress in a variety of ways, there are many different places where we still fall short, where our own kind of muscles around a deep commitment and deep practice around equity and justice is still lacking and still in need of strengthening. So I'll just sort of
not to interrupt the fun, but we'll get started again.
Oh, okay.
And as folks make their way back into the room, folks are moving around seats. We're going to be moving around seats quite a bit, so you'll be able to like mix and mingle throughout the whole morning session, and get to know folks.
I'll keep going.
Yet. During the break, I did by Dr. Barbara.
You can hear me, right? Okay. So I'll just touch lightly on the kind of 5 areas where we have really put an intentional, proactive focus in service of institutional transformation. And the first one that I'm about to speak to, I think might resonate because it really speaks to ways of knowing. So one of our really intentional strategies has been to develop a shared and historically grounded analysis and approach for advancing intersectional racial equity, partly because this is still a new way of being at the foundation. And so that has meant a lot of different, it's meant learning, it's meant conversations and dialogue with our governing body, our staff, our partners, but it has also meant starting a truth, repair, and transformation process where we have looked at our own origin story and legacy and the ways in which we have been a part of the problem. And doing this it's not about self-flagellation. It's really about looking at ourselves more clearly so that we can deepen and accelerate the ways in which we have already started to change. And also because very often the past is still alive in the present, right? It's not ancient history when I talk about our more recent approaches to structural racism, to reproductive justice. These are all fairly new muscles for the foundation. And so we cannot solve a problem that we ourselves are not able to name and frame, and if we don't see ourselves clearly. So that has been one big push on our end. The second is really about just building an organizational culture of belonging. Many of you work in institutions where even as you take on this work, it's hard to when there isn't a critical mass of people who both are reflective of the communities that we come from, but also feel a sense of belonging. So that has been one other piece of our work. The third approach has really been about building sustainable and supported structures to organize for equity within the foundation and also beyond. And again, I think all of you know that very often when change happens, it doesn't happen because someone in a leadership position wanted it to happen. Usually by the time that decision has been made, there has been a lot of organizing that has led to that. And this is true, for example, with the shifts that we have made around reproductive justice for years. Women of color inside the foundation and also grantee partners external to the foundation pushed for us to do more, to be bolder. We didn't until 2020, which again is very recent. Because it was perceived as too much of a risk, right? And so I share all of that to also share about the need to tend to the conditions within in order for us to do our boldest work externally. The fourth area, and again, we can go much deeper into this in the panel and throughout the day, is to codify systems of accountability for equity. I often say that we cannot train our way out of racism and other inequities. There are some things that we want to make sure that everyone does as a matter of process and protocol, regardless of where each of us might be. And so that has been, in terms of hiring, in terms of grant making practices, how do we systematize some things so that equity is hardwired into our processes? And then the last is really more explicitly addressing structural racism and other barriers to health in all of our programmatic work. Because if you look at our portfolio of work, our programmatic work even 5 years ago, it looks quite different from what it is now. And that rebalancing needs to continue as we go deeper into a focus on equity and justice. So those are some of the areas. I think the last thing I wanted to just say is that I know how hard it is to do this work, and many of you do this on behalf of institutions, whether this kind of equity-centered change is formally a part of your title or informally something that you do. It lives in your work, and it is hard work. And so I just wanted to say that I see you. I appreciate all of us at the foundation, deeply appreciate what you carry on behalf of communities and institutions. And thank you for all your work leading up to this culminating event. And thank you for having me as a part of this community today.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I'm going to go ahead and call our other participants from our other symposia up to the stage, Dr. Antwi Akam, Chin-Chi Wang, Annie Belcourt, so that we can share with you a little bit of the experiences that we had over the last few symposia. Welcome, welcome. I'm Erin Hagan. I'm the Deputy Director for Evidence for Action. I'm so thrilled to be with you all today and that you were willing to take time out of your day to be here with us. As Chin-Chi and is making her way, and Annie also is making her way up. I just want to, underscore the organizing analogies that have been being made so far this morning. We've really thought about this in that way across the 5 events. We've been talking about these this year as sort of town hall gatherings. My own background comes from an advocacy space. And so we have thought about this as sort of the base building, organizing our base to understand what our priorities are, and then moving into more action. And one of the things you might have seen as you were coming in today was the analogy around stones, stone builders, stone curators, stone throwers. And that came up in our last symposia in DC around our various roles in this organizing work, and recognizing that all of these roles are necessary. And whether anyone individually feels comfortable in a particular position does not mean that your activities and your contributions are not also valuable, and recognizing that together is where our power lies to make change. So these our balance that we had to strike throughout these symposia was to have them be small enough so that we could do real work together. These were not conferences where we were teaching. This is where we were gathering people together to prioritize our path towards change. And so that inherently meant that we had to make trade-offs around how many people could be in those spaces, which was one of the more difficult aspects of this entire process. And so today, we want to try to share with you a little bit about what those experiences were like at each of the individual symposia. And I'm so grateful to each of you to be willing to do that and to share on behalf of the people who are joining us in those meetings. And then we are going to keep working together to do some of that ongoing prioritization, both this morning and then more thoroughly this afternoon. So I'll let you each, as you're speaking, maybe say a little bit more about yourselves, but I just want to start. So our first symposia after the kickoff in New Orleans was in Prairie, Montana, around Indigenous ways of knowing. And both of our co-organizers, I believe, are here. Melissa Walls and Joe Gaughan are both here today. So thank you both for coming back to join us for the culminating event. And Annie was also in Montana with us. And then somehow we convinced you to come to all the rest of the symposia. And so if you could maybe start by sharing with folks a little bit about what Montana was like, but then how did we manage to convince you to keep coming back? And just one other quick point that I really want to share. One of the things that we will not be able to replicate, but we want to try to share with you, is the energy that came out of these spaces. So these at times were very heavy spaces, and maybe every meeting tears were shed. But somehow, as I mentioned, Annie kept coming back and she wanted to come again. We wondered why he only got to come to the last meeting. And so people did seem to leave with a sense of optimism and hope. And so that's what we want to try to share with you, is some of that feeling that arose from our collective time together. So Annie, if you don't mind starting us off.
Thank you. First, I will introduce myself. Oki Nistun Tanako Amanisaki. My name is Annie Belcourt, or Otter Woman. And I want to thank, Joe and Michelle, sorry, Melissa, Michelle was there too, for organizing a wonderful meeting in Prairie, Montana. And I'll talk with you a little bit about each of those meetings. But I wanted to also just share with you, I was so grateful for the opening comments about where we are. And, I am a physical representation of where we are. I am on my father's side, I am Blackfeet, and I am also Chippewa. And then on my mother's side, I'm Mandan Hidatsan. So here in St. Louis is where the Lewis and Clark journey started. And that journey involved all of my tribal backgrounds. And so what an important thing that kind of was reflected in the meetings is the importance of how we as Indigenous people are here, how we continue to live in a confluence of culture and space and reclamation. And I think that's the work that we are very, committed to trying to work on. And one of the stories I'll share, because we are, as Native people, storytellers, and that's the culture we come from. We don't come from the culture of the Christian church and background. We come from a culture of our stories, and those stories live here, and they live in us. We are star people, and those are those stories that are continued to be practiced today. And so the story is basically the story of the day I burned a hole in the Kentucky bluegrass of the Montana Oval. And that is really indicative of the work that many of us as Native scholars are doing. We are bringing back our culture. We are bringing back our ceremonial leaders. We are not asking anymore. We are very committed to providing voice to our elders, to our communities, in ways that is not asking for permission anymore. Because as somebody who really, I was brought up in an NIH model of being funded through that process. And I was funded, really through graduate school all the way until a few years ago, right before the pandemic, when I realized kind of look behind the curtains of Oz to see that what I was participating in was a slow description of the eradication of our culture and our communities. We were having science that was not serving our community. We were having science that was describing, as I've said, the color of water that we were drowning in. And that is something I was not willing to like participate in. And it wasn't until, the last year or so, I started to kind of regain faith, if you will, in science. And the reason I was able to do that was because I was, basically had refused, and I'm not saying NIH cannot change and be more receptive to more applied science and research and scholarship. But I made a decision to invest in scholars who I knew our culture, knew our language, knew the ways of healing that are inherent in living within our communities. And so we brought to our campus people like Apamaka, who is one of our spiritual elders from Canada, and he performed a pipe ceremony on our campus. He did a naming ceremony for some of our students. These are things that matter to our people. And these are ways that we heal each other. And these are ways that we come back from grief that we've, experienced due to colonization and genocide. And as people, that is the ultimate act of resistance that we can engage in, is that we can invest in the people who say no. And that's what I think many of us are here to do, is to say no, and that this process will stop. So we've had a lot of Indigenous scientists who have such wonderful clarity, like Melissa and Joe, who speak to the critique of this process of a colonized science, and who have spoken very elegantly about the need for us to disentangle our ways of knowing from that process, and to realize that so much truth, knowledge, and wisdom is living within our communities, and to start to invest in that process of healing in the ways that we think about our stories. And our stories are not myths. The story of Scarface lives on our reservation. We have brought back our societies. I'm a member of our Buffalo Women's Society, our Moto Geeks. That was brought back this year. And there were, 13 of us who helped bring that back. A few years ago, we brought back our Men's Society, our Horn Society, we've brought back our OCON. We're doing this without any funding. We don't have NIH funding. We don't have, these sources of, but what we are doing is the work that needs to happen within our communities to stand against racism. And that's the work that our ancestors began. And so as we decolonize research, we really have to step into that framework of not asking for permission, not being reactive, but being intentional with our steps, with our ability to repatriate. Even within our ceremonies, we have a special place for people who are LGBTQ. And that is something that has been really important for our Native people who identify differently. Before colonization, we had all these different ways of identifying. We celebrated our identities in different ways. And yet now we ask permission. And so I think part of what we did at that meeting was start to give ourselves permission to do the work that matters most to us, which is, corresponding to Western philosophies of justice, beneficence, and respect. However, it's done so in a way that is indigenized, that is centering, the confluence of culture, race, healing, and ways of knowing. And those are important factors for Native people. So the critiques that were levied, many of them were internal. That was discussed a little bit this morning, thinking about ways we can decolonize processes within universities, ways we can think about advocating for indirect cost monies to benefit communities instead of benefiting large universities that are corporations built on, knowledge and ways that are not culturally neutral. And so as we start to think about that and advocating for that change, also advocating for Native scholars who can successfully navigate that system in ways where they can prioritize their works and values that aren't just using a system of science that's based on looking and documenting suffering. We want our communities to not, be rightfully cynical about the work that is done within science, because this has been a history of oppression within Western scientific practice. You know, we all know that. I don't have to preach to this room, but for Native people, there's a lot of distrust. And that distrust comes from having our children forcibly removed, being forced to speak different languages, being forced to, you know, believe in different ways that are not our own. Right now, it's a privilege for Native people to know their own creation stories, to know their own languages, to know their own culture. And that has to change in fundamental ways. You know, it shouldn't be the fact that anyone can walk into any town in America and have immediate access to Christianity and yet not have access to our cultural ways and our stories. So all of us have to kind of be part of that process, not just Native people. Last week I spoke with my faculty, and this is the reason I wanted to come to all the meetings, is because I'm a rabble rouser, but also because you know, the time and the urgency of now is upon us. This is not something that we can wait for. This is not a legacy that we can provide our children, one that they'll fix it. No, we have to fix this right now. This is not a equitable way of being in the world. And so, you know, for my Department of Public Health at the University of Montana is a wonderful place. I have wonderful colleagues. They bring in about $20 million in extramural funding every year. You know, 0.05% of that goes back to Native communities. That has to stop. We have to do things that actually prioritize our Native communities rather than document their suffering. And that is something that in the state of Montana, we can no longer accept the fact that 30% of our children are in foster care. We can no longer accept that 20% of people who are Native are in prisons. You know, this is something that we have to stand against. And I am sick of like being apathetic and not saying the words that need to be spoken, because this is something that we all have to join in on. And we need allies, we need friends, we need all of the things. But it's got to stop, you know, because, you know, the mark of these stressors and all of this kind of cumulative trauma is upon all of us, especially as Native people and as Native scholars. So many of us, you know, have to walk around with a lot of pain that we learn about, and that's something that we can change. So across the 3 different meetings, or 3 or 4 now, you know, it was wonderful to see the allies that we have and the languages that we speak that are in common. And those are our languages of wanting advocacy, wanting change, wanting true ways to center community and community voices, to begin to, you know, work to decolonize, you know, the process of science in ways that are some ways simple. You know, listen to the community, provide funding to the community, provide resources to the community. These are not sort of like really radical ideas, but in some ways they are. And so as we work to think about that, you know, I encourage each of you to think about that as you travel, as you're here in St. Louis. You know, look around you and be aware of the history and the surroundings. As a psychologist, this is something that I think about a lot, is meaning reconstruction and how we can help people of color to reconstruct the meaningful narrative around their health and their healing. And that's one of the things that came up as a theme throughout all of the different meetings, is how we as people can help support that effort. And that's a very meaningful effort. And it's something that can help our communities change some of these statistics that I'm frankly sick of seeing. And I would love to be out of work if it meant that we wouldn't have these inequalities. I would love that. But we have to find ways to be better and do better.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Anna. Wow, absolutely. Thank you. You know, one of the things you talked about a lot was process. And so I think that is something that has come up so much at the meetings. It's like, we want to get past the what do we need to do and get into the how do we do that? How do we reconstruct these systems? Because you're right that these ideas don't seem so revolutionary, but in the context of this health science knowledge system, they have become revolutionary ideas, like that research is for the purpose of serving the community. And so that has been and will continue to be today and throughout the rest of this work about what we are trying to get at. How do we make these changes, not just what changes are necessary? And Chinchi, you joined us first at our community meeting, our transforming community-led research meeting. And then immediately you were like, I have to come to DC too. And what was so, fantastic about you saying that was that you also were very clear to say, I am not a researcher. And maybe you are a researcher and you just don't call yourself that. But the point is, you knew that the meeting in DC was really going to be about methods and research approaches, and you still wanted to be there. And we're very confident about your role there, which when you came was clearly apparent. And there was where the analogy about stone throwing came up in these different roles. And so maybe if you can share with folks some first about the community meeting and how that played out, but also, your role as a stone thrower in this research space.
Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to thank the organizer to, have me at this gathering. I feel really honored because I came to this country as an international student. And when I first came to this country, I can hardly carry your English, a conversation in English. And here I am addressing you in English about this very, very complicated symposia. So a little bit more background about me. So I'm a breast cancer survivor turned patient advocate, and I immigrated from Taiwan. And it's important to say that because that's one of the reasons why I wanted to participate in the second symposia, because it was about anti-racist, anti-colonial research. And I think that many people may not know that Taiwan actually was colonized by Dutch, by the Spanish, by the Manchurian, by even the Japanese and Chinese. So I feel compelled to be at the DC gathering, even though it was, mostly for the researchers. And so at the previous symposium, it was a space designed to bring the community members and the researchers together to talk about how we can work together to to bridge the service gap and to remove the systemic barriers. So for the past 10 years, I was the founder and former executive director of Asian Women for Health, which is a nonprofit organization in Massachusetts. And the reason why I started the nonprofit was because as I was in treatment, I see that many Asian women, because of cultural and linguistic barrier, were not able to access the important information and support in a timely fashion. So I started a nonprofit organization to train other Asian women to deliver culturally responsive and linguistically appropriate care and peer support. So during this past 10 years, I had the opportunity to work with academic institutions to do different research on breast cancer, on mental health. And it was during those collaboration, I just really personally experienced all the things that Anne just talked about, that there's lack of trust and there's an equal power dynamic between the community and the academic institutions. So at the second symposium that I participated, I keep hearing that that's the thing, is that people, there's this gap, and how can we work together to address this? How can we build trust? And then I think at that symposium, what I came away with is that we need to learn from the other movement. Like there was this slogan that came from the disabled, movement, that they say that nothing about us without us. So that was something that's really, really made an impression on me. And then when I learned that there's going to be another symposium just for the researchers, and I say that, well, that's not right. If we talk about, nothing about us without us, how can you not have the community voice? So I advocate very, very fervently for me to be at the symposium. And I was very, very glad that I went. And for those of you who attended that symposium, you'll remember that, you know, the organizers sent along a article and to use this metaphor that the system is kind of like this building, right? And so our job is to work on this building, you know, because it has holes, it has all kinds of problems. But we can't just, you know, we can't just like the wrecking ball trying to bulldoze the whole building down, right? It's not going to work because we're all inhabitants in that building. And so when we have that keynote, and then I asked this this question, like, you know, so I see myself as a role as a stone thrower, you know, but sometimes I feel like I just pick up the stone more than I realize I can handle. And I probably will, you know, so my question to the keynote speaker was that, what can we do to, you know, to protect ourselves and also the people who work around us so we don't like pick up too much and then, you know, and the consequences is like hurting ourselves and also people around us. So I remember the keynote just, you know, say that, well, you just need to be very specific and very clear about each individual's role. And that's why I think that, you know, when you come to this event today, outside of the room, there was like little dots that we're hoping that each of you will pick a dot that symbolize your role in this movement. And then so we can get together and use the space and time here today to talk about how we can each use the time we're here to figure out how can we work together to do the next step. Yeah. So I'm sure that there's things that I don't remember, but I hope that it will come out. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chin-Chi. So one of the things also that came up at the last meeting was that people felt like we were in a moment. And the idea behind all of the symposia were that they would convene people who had been already doing this work for a very long time. So all of you are examples of that. You're sort of the OGs of anti-racist, anti-colonial, racial justice, indigenous justice work. And despite all of the talk that we've had so far about the other moment that we're in, that feels like an affront to our work, it still felt like we were in a moment where change was possible. And so, Antwi, maybe you can talk a little more about, and you, even in preparing for this, you were so inspiring in reminding us that we still have that power in this moment. And so if you can maybe share some of that with everyone else too.
Okay. Hey everyone. My name is Antwi Acombe. My father's from Ghana, West Africa. My mother and grandmother from Louisiana. My children are African American and Apache, Black and Indigenous. My pronouns are he and him. So yeah, I've been asked to sort of try to capture some of what we spoke about at the Challenging the Norm. And I want to say thank you to the organizers and thank you to the ancestors as well. I think one of the things that came up was this idea that if racism and sexism and transphobia and all these other kinds of inequalities are designed, then they can be redesigned. And I think that that's something that we really want to hold on to. And I think what also came up was this idea that if data is power, and in the context of Project 2025, if we see that systems and structures are now being put in place to make data invisible and the people and stories that go along with that data, we're seeing that the institutions are being weaponized. Institutions that were there to protect us, right? And first, let me just say, everybody needs to read Project 2025. Because I see there's lots of people who I've spoken to out, you know, on the streets, in the hood, in the community. It's like, you know about Project 2025? Oh, yeah. And then you're like, okay, well, tell me a little bit. Let's talk about it. Like, well, I haven't really read it, right? I think, you know, it's a 900-page manifesto and a blueprint that is already being operationalized and institutionalized. And it's mission critical that every single person reads Project 2025 in detail. And I want to get to sort of what we need to do about it and our collective response to it, but we need to know it inside and out. And one of the things that we'll see in Project 2025, and this all came up in the context of the symposium, was how institutions and structures that were meant to protect us are being weaponized against us. So whether that means the elimination of the Department of Education or the reimagination of the Department of Justice, where standing for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusivity, now folks have the Department of Justice to criminalize those things, to squeeze the funding out of those things, right? So this is a whole brand new world that we're living in. Institutions that used to protect us are now being aimed to harm and hurt us. And we have to understand that. So now more than ever, we need to go back to the Underground Railroad. We need to go back to the things that we've been doing for so long, things that have sustained us for centuries, about how do we shift the balance of power so that the people who are closest to the problem have the tools, technologies, pedagogies, and practices to unleash their own brilliant solutions. And for me, one of the real questions that I'd like all of us to think about is where is our Project 2025 blueprint? Where is our 900-page manifesto? Right? Where is it? Right? So we need opportunities like this to create our own and begin executing it and implementing it. We are like 40 years, 50 years, 100, like we're way behind in terms of where we need to be. Additionally, we need to not only where is our manifesto, our blueprint for change, but the people behind the change were so strategic. So many, many foundations have been behind this. One of those foundations was the Heritage Foundation. Right? They like charted out the whole course. So we know that we need the people who are for us and for all of the amazing work that all of you are doing in this room and all of us are doing in this room collectively. And RWJ has stepped up, but we need all foundations and private corporations to step up. Folks have to step up, step out, and commit billions of dollars to the project of justice, equity, diversity, inclusivity. And we need to be very public about this. If you've noticed, they're very public about what they do. They're very clear. There's no fear in how they're moving. They're actually proud of how they're moving in their agenda. We need public commitments that we stand with you and we stand for you. We need the resources and we need access to those resources. We need to keep showing up. We need to keep showing out. We need to keep doing the work. We need to keep standing in solidarity and in community with each other and with folks who are oppressed. We need to keep believing that as long as we maintain our own humanity in the face of inhumanity, right? As long as we resist the urge to maintain the status quo, and this came up quite often in our symposium, like we're all balancing sort of this urge to maintain the status quo, or what does it really mean to resist? And the answer is that there's many different forms, but what's important is that we don't let our fear to ask tough questions stop us from doing the right thing. And that came up over and over again, that our fear or our desire to not want to rock the boat too much, rock it just a little bit, not too much, has stopped us from collectively having a greater impact than we could. That was one of the real tensions that came up over and over and over again in that symposium. Instead, what we need to be doing is reimagining and revolutionizing the structures and institutions that can help every single community reach their full potential. And, you know, I was talking to, I go to sort of an African-centered spiritual healing center. And I was talking to what we'll call a pastor, to you all, but I'm not sure what the title is. But she asked me, you know, Antwi, can you rise from the rubble of loss and grief and incarceration? I'm a formerly incarcerated person, but so many of the people in our communities are, from unjustly, by the way, police brutality, that's what we're talking about. From the mental incarceration of ego, which I thought was really powerful, because so many times, again, what I see in the forces that are against us is they're willing to overlook, oh, you're a criminal. That's okay. You know, you've been accused of sexual abuse and harassment. That's okay. They're aligning on the mission, the greater mission of holding up white supremacy. We fracture. We're not sure, are you a Bernie Democrat or are you a Harris Democrat? Are you an Obama Democrat or are you this guy, right? And we don't know and haven't done a good enough job of coming together. This all came up during the symposium. How do we organize more effectively? We have to organize way more effectively than we've been doing. So she asked me, the mental disillusionment of betrayal. She asked me, even if people are dying or people are not talking to you in your own family, can you emerge from all of this chaos and confusion around you and recognize all of the magic and miracles inside of you with your humanity intact? And I thought that was a powerful question for all of us. So I thought I would bring it to you all and share it with you all. And she reminded me that what we are not going to do is we're not going to forget that we are the change that we are waiting for, that we have the power, that we don't have to wait for, look, there's many, many foundations doing amazing work and private organizations. RWJ is one of them. There's many who aren't. Well, as Annie said, and others have said, we've been doing this on our own anyway. We need to keep moving forward together. Some other key themes that I just want to quickly bring up that came up around challenging the norm and redefining rigor and resisting the urge to maintain the status quo was transforming our research imagination. The need to transform our research imagination from focusing on, and this came up earlier, from problems and pathologies to poisons to looking at assets and agency and aspirations, to lift up community-driven, community-powered, community-owned data and make lived experience primary rather than secondary. Research for liberation, sharing knowledge and tools, research that builds on indigenous ways of knowing and being, research that has direct community benefits. I really enjoyed the woman who opened with Facing Race talking about the intentionality around community benefits. Research that addresses power imbalances, that's non-exploitative, and seeing researchers as facilitators, but the community folks are as the experts in their own lived experience. The final piece that I'll say, there's a lot more to say, but I want to be respectful of time, was really around data and designing justice and what it means to put those things at the forefront of ensuring that we have equitable interpretation, representation, and accountability of participants and communities that have been historically locked out and left out of these conversations. The energy there and the energy in all of these has been transformative. We need the space and time to stretch out in these ways and build community with each other. We need the space and time and the grace to strategize with one another, but it can't be one and done. It has to be ongoing ways that we're able to come together, create our blueprint for transformation and change, led by and with community. And that was pretty much many of the key themes that came up in the challenging the norm conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Antwi. Yeah, thanks. Thank you all. We have one other thing we were going to talk about, but in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap us up, especially because I just so appreciate the brilliance that is in the room with us and recognizing that many of you are here with us around this conversation for the first time and knowing that we have plans for us to dig into that work more together and wanting to get to that. I just want to really reflect on two quick things. One is that you all talked about sort of reimagining and the need for our imagination and knowing that imagination can really get stifled when you're in these oppressive places. And then also going back to one of the things that that I think people appreciated, or at least said to me that they appreciated about these spaces, but it was that they did not have to spend time justifying their existence in the space, and the importance of not needing to validate their way of being. And that's something Melissa mentioned in the very first kickoff, was that research has to stop being the tool to validate people's experience. It has to be a tool to build on those experiences. And one of the tools in the toolbox, which Tom Leviste often talks about, the variety of tools we have to work towards our collective liberation. And so that is one of the goals of this, these symposia in general, is to really focus on the process, which you mentioned, Annie, how we do the work that we're doing, so that it is no longer Western white science validating people's existence and ways of being, and instead using scientific methods as a way and other ways to add to the myriad of ways that we know what we know, and that we work towards justice for our communities. So thank you all for joining us.
Next, I'd love to welcome back to the stage Fiona, Amani, and Tom. Amani and Tom kicked off our Ways of Knowing Symposia conversation alongside Alonzo Plow, who's the Chief Science Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so we thought it would only be fitting that Amani and Tom close us out, and we're thrilled to have Fiona here alongside them. They are going to spend some time talking about how you actually do internal and external systems change. And they're going to talk about this from their own perspectives and storied careers. So we're really excited to have them here to close out our Ways of Knowing Symposia. And we have saved about 10 minutes at the end of their conversation for some questions, if folks have questions. So does everybody have their mics? All right, and without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Amani to kick us off.
Okay, I'm gonna use this one. Can people in the back hear me? Okay, thank you. So wow, it was hard to pull away from those tables, and it's interesting that we're going to be talking about institutional change. Our table was having a lot of conversations about institutional change. I feel like in the past year, I've just wanted to quit everything. And that conversation made me want to quit my job. Not the evidence for action, not the evidence for action part of my job, the other part, the academic part of my job. Okay, so I have a question that I'm going to start out with, and I think we'll just kind of see where it goes. So this whole symposia, the conversations that you all have been having at these tables has really been all about change, right? And it's one thing to think about change from an individual perspective, and we can all think about how we can do that, right? Checking our biases, maybe as an academic myself, thinking about how I can use my own research to make change, whether it's through, we were talking about dissemination, other ways to disseminate that are maybe not traditional in academia, but are really targeted to where we know the impact really needs to happen. So how do we make change individually, but going beyond that, how do we make institutional change? That's a much more difficult, I think, question to answer, because we don't always have control over that. So I'll just open up with that question. If Fiona, we could start with you, just thinking about, because I know you all have done a lot of institutional change, and I'll just, say to start that I remember, so a few years ago at Berkeley, I was responsible for leading the development and implementation of an anti-racism program within the School of Public Health, and it was hard work and it was hard work. Right. But then as it kept going, everyone was like really, really excited about it. And then over time, people are like, oh, Dr. Nuru Jeter is making the School of Public Health hostile against white people. Or Dr. Nuru Jeter is being racist. So still, like, within institutions, it's one thing to impact individuals, but how do you create sustainable change, knowing that there is going to be a body of resistance there, right? And I think one last thing I'll say is that, and we've seen this in national polls, that people will say ideologically, I believe in X, Y, and Z. But when the next question in those same polls are, would you be willing to give up X so that Y can happen? People are like, no. So who are we ideologically, but who are we really? What are we really willing and able to give up? What are we able to sacrifice for that institutional change? Because it is a sacrifice. So I'll just, yeah.
No, that is such a big question. And in some ways, I have the privilege of having a role at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that is, in fact, dedicated to leading that change. And I recognize that not every institution has someone in my role. Not everyone here necessarily has that role where your entire job is to do that, right? So that's just sort of like one piece that I wanted to start with. You know, when I started at the foundation has been on a process of some level of transformation for some time, but very often it was led in different pockets of the foundation, often by, you know, I talked a little bit in my opening remarks about the role of organizing. So there were champions at different parts of the foundation already pushing in a couple of different ways. I think the two probably, there's several different approaches that I have found helpful, but the two things that I did start with in a more proactive and intentional way when I got there was one, really normalizing the conversation first around the approach for doing this, because absolutely, Amani, I mean, you mentioned that there are lots of people who say, you know, I believe I support equity, but I don't like how you do it, right? So they kind of focus on the process rather than the values, right? And so some of what we started to do was kind of talk about why this is mission critical work, because there were also, even internally within an institution, so we have about 300 plus staff, but then also a lot of partners and grantees who in some ways also have benefited from the foundation's traditional way of doing things. So many of the folks in this room may not have been historically who the foundation supported, right? So if you imagine as we shifted, there were legacy grantees who were not necessarily happy with the direction that we were going in. And so part of it was really explaining that for us to do the external work, we have to do the internal shift. So there was kind of lots of conversations with different levels of the foundation and our constituents. So that was a part of it, but also explaining and laying the groundwork for the pushback that was bound to come. And I say this, that laying that groundwork needs to happen at a few levels, at the individual level, to make sure that there is a level of, it's never safe, but where you kind of are increasing the safety of the people who are trying to do this work. So this includes preparing the leadership of the foundation, our governing body, for what pushback can look like. It often looks like the weaponization, for example, of anonymous complaint systems to, talk about reverse racism. It looks like people sort of complaining that there's too much on their plate. And so sometimes it's related to bandwidth. I mean, it shows up in different ways, but so it was necessary for us to do some of that work. And then I think the other thing that felt important to do, because the first piece that I mentioned is very, it's a bit more in your face. You're sort of naming in very explicit ways what to expect, why this work is mission critical, what you're framing and naming in very explicit ways. The other, and I often say that the revolution doesn't always have to be televised, right? There are sometimes the way to mitigate pushback and backlash is to do it more quietly behind the scenes and to use partners so that you're not always the person in front moving it forward. So how we kind of started to look, and I was looking at some of the themes, and at the table that I was at for a while, a lot of the conversation was on sort of the structures and the culture beyond the individuals who are doing this work. So we looked at our hiring protocols, and those are some of the things that we've been building. How do we make sure that our own systems of rewarding performance actually build in competencies related to equity? And it's been a work in progress. There was no way, for example, to hold people accountable to say that we value people who actually have an anti-racist lens and posture. And how do we make that behaviors that we are going to reward through promotions and through And at the same time, for people who don't, like, what does that mean in terms of actual consequences? So that's one example in terms of our grant making as well, really like systematizing as far as possible. We know that a lot happens in individual spaces, like, program officers build relationships in their own way, and there is some flexibility for that. But at the same time, can we get clear about some things that everyone's got to do? And then also just using data, like the foundation, as you all know, is known to be evidence-based, but we haven't always applied that same data to monitor our own performance. So actually kind of shining a light to say, let's look at, we have had this commitment to address structural racism, but when I first got to the foundation 2 years ago, only maybe 40% of our grantees were actually led by people of color. And that number is likely to be inflated because we were looking at project directors rather than organizational leaders, for example. And so, I mean, those are some of the things where you start to build into processes and protocols, and that it still requires buy-in from leadership. So those were some of the things we started, and I can get into more detail, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, so the question was about how to make organizational change. And my answer, I've been sitting here trying to think of how to answer that question. And my truthful answer is that I don't know. I don't know how to make organizational change. I know what I've tried to do throughout my career, and I know what I'm trying to do now. And I can maybe have some insights there. And, throughout most of my career, I mean, as you know, most of my career has been in academia, and I was mostly at one institution. Johns Hopkins was a very, very traditional research university in academia. And, throughout my time there, I spent a lot of time speaking truth to power and trying to get the university to do things differently. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes they would allocate resources based on how I wanted them to. And sometimes they didn't. And then I decided at one point, I said, what would it be like to actually be the one in power? Let people speak to me, and then I get to decide, and let's see how that would work out. And that's when I decided to go into academic administration, when those opportunities started to develop. And when I took my first job in administration as a department chair, right? And when that was announced that I was making that move, I started getting phone calls and text messages, emails from all my, health equity scholar friends. And what are you doing? You're going to the dark side and all that, and some people whose names you would recognize if I said them. But what that showed me was just how can I say this in a politic way? Well, let's forget politics. How clueless we can be sometimes about what really academia is. And I think most people, if you think of academia as a place where you create new knowledge and you impart that new knowledge to future generations, if that's all you think academia is, then you are missing the boat on what these institutions really are. In many states, universities are the biggest employer in your state. In Maryland, Johns Hopkins, the richest state in the country, Johns Hopkins is the biggest employer. Johns Hopkins has power that is unrecognized because of that. If the president of Johns Hopkins says to the governor of Maryland, I'm going to announce layoffs tomorrow, I'm going to lay off 20,000 people, this will have huge implications for the budget of the state of Maryland, and this would cause a great concern for the governor, right? So you have power when you're in academia. New Orleans, Tulane is the biggest employer in the city of New Orleans. When we changed our low-wage employees from minimum wage, the minimum wage in New Orleans is the national minimum wage. So we're talking $7 an hour, right? And when we changed that and said, well, the city of New Orleans wanted to raise the minimum wage for the city, the state preempted the city from doing it, right? So the city could not raise the minimum wage. Tulane said, all right, well, we're a private institution. We can do what we want. And we're the biggest employer, so we're going to just do it anyway. How many families were raised out of poverty that moment that happened? That's power. When we moved our bank accounts into Liberty Bank, which is the largest Black-owned bank in the country, we moved our accounts from national banks into Liberty Bank, which allows them to now do more mortgages and business loans right there in New Orleans. That's power. That is what academic administration can be. When we changed the policy and ensured that every employee had an email address, even the housekeeping staff, and now they can have access to the computer labs, which means they can now log on at night while we're not there, log on and look for jobs and do whatever. That's power, that's impact. And that's bigger impact than most people will ever accomplish as a professor. So what I'm saying is that how do you make institutional change? At least my theory right now is to be in a position where you get to make the decisions about what the institution is doing. And there's so many of us, I think, that are more progressively oriented that, we eschew power. We eschew that. We think that we're mad at the mayor because the mayor did something that we don't like. So we hate mayors. No, the mayor is not the problem. The person in the mayorship is the problem. So become the mayor. That's my philosophy at this point, because speaking truth to power will get you only so far. At least that's what my experience has taught me. And now I as many of you as possible, try to put yourself in a position where you get to make the decisions, and then see how that works out. That's what's on my mind right now.
So those were both really insightful responses. I mean, it's real experience, right? Like change isn't easy. I think one question that I have, we're here because of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, through Partners for Advancing Health Equity and Evidence for Action. Some of us are grantees, some of us work for those organizations, some of us are partners of the foundation. In our respective roles, in thinking about this from a philanthropic perspective, what role can philanthropy play in institutional change? And I'm thinking about funders as gatekeepers. Like, I truly believe that, especially now that I've been with Evidence for Action, the critical role that funders can play, not just in giving out grants, like Aaron and I commonly have conversations about, that is really important to do the work on the ground, but field building, right? Having a platform to have a voice, to convene others, to kind of bring people together, to actually action on all of the findings that you all are coming up with through your research. I really think philanthropy can play an incredible role because of the platform that we have in directing and saying what is knowledge, right? Like, we can change the whole game on what actually is knowledge and where did it come from? Because some of us have been doing this work for so long, other people have not, but they're going to chase the money, right? They're going to go where the money is. So, you're in philanthropy, you obviously have been funded a ton. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the role of just philanthropy in general, whether you are the philanthropic organization or the recipient of funding.
Yeah.
In 5 minutes.
What I would love to hear your thoughts as well. I mean, just in terms of, institutional change and the role that all of you, like the role that we can play as well. So yes, absolutely. When I think about philanthropic institutions like RWJF, in some ways, it's not completely different from academic institutions, right? We are part of the ecosystem. We can either be helpful or sometimes we can hinder progress, and sometimes we do both at the same time. I do think that what we fund absolutely makes a difference to the field building piece. And then there is more than just the grant making dollars. So I think one is, as a philanthropic institution, especially in the current context where there has been retrenchment from many philanthropies around work that is much more explicit, I think the most important thing for us, and Claire referenced that in her comments earlier, that the most important thing is that we, one, stay the course, and not just stay the course because it won't be business as usual even for us, right? But that we actually double down on a commitment to racial equity and racial justice. So that's, I think, really important. And it's also important because in many ways we don't experience the same risks that many grantees, especially those who are, movement leaders and organizers face. And I think it's important to say, because actually philanthropy is often really risk averse, right? We have some of the, especially large philanthropies, have some of the largest law departments. I am an outsider to philanthropy before I joined the foundation. We have always, there's a tendency to protect our own institutions. And often when we do that, we pass the risk along to less resourced grantee organizations. So I actually think that that's a really important posture for us to hold. How can we be bolder, given that we don't face the same level of risk, or even when we are under attack, we have resources to be able to continue the work, and sometimes in ways that others don't. So that's one. I think absolutely speaking to the role of rebalancing. I talked a little bit about that earlier. What we fund matters. And often in the models, I know that philanthropy, including RWJF, has funded the ways in which, and we have gotten feedback from grantees that we need to do better as well, like the pairing of, community groups with academic institutions, where one of the themes I saw as well is around the power dynamics, how philanthropy actually addresses. We have a role actually in addressing many of the themes that you all have surfaced through the symposia. And so how do we use our resources, one, to actually rebalance towards some sources of expertise that have been historically excluded, and at the same time, when we are in partnership with powerful institutions, including academic institutions, sometimes including, we have a policy department, so this could be people on the Hill, right? When we are in partnership with them, how do we actually use our influence and power to also hold accountable to the goals of equity? It can be hard in the current administration to think about what that looks like, right? Because it is, how do you work with, when I say, I mean the incoming administration, how do you work with powerful individuals so that they can also be held to account? But I know that in a lot of our work, we have supported institutions that have not moved the needle at all on racial equity, right? Large institutions. So how do we use our influence in better ways? So that's one part of it. And then the piece related to using our voice, I do think, as many of you have said, that it is really important to call the thing what it is. I think that there's a tendency to want to dilute our language in this moment. I hear people say, we have to be more careful. Like, do we talk about structural race? I mean, like, it's kind of the same conversations we had 5 years ago before we kind of got here. They're coming back, right? And so I think it's really important that we use our voice powerfully, because many of our grantees have told us that that's what solidarity with them in this moment, especially as they come under attack, looks like. We also are looking at providing, legal support to grantee organizations that are facing legal attacks in an increasingly hostile environment to equity. So I think those are some of the ways in which I feel like we have a role to play, and even more so now, because I feel like we are better placed to weather what is going to be what has already been a very difficult environment, but an increasingly hostile environment to efforts for equity.
Yeah, I agree. Academia, philanthropy is like academia in the sense that it's a powerful industry that has huge influence, and with proper leadership who's thinking along these lines, you could really make a difference. And I think the Robert Johnson Foundation really should be commended as one organization that, you talk about where maybe you have not been as impactful as you could, but just the whole concept of culture of health and how that has impacted the overall thinking, I think, across the country has been huge. And it's really placed social determinants it's sort of placed that, or elevated it to a position of prominence that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And I think the Robert Johnson Foundation is really, was the foundation that, foundation, not in the terms of foundation, but in the foundational in doing that. So I think philanthropy can be hugely important if that's wielded properly. Also, as a counterbalance to other sectors, you're a counterbalance to government, or you're a counterbalance to private sector. You have the ability to also engage in equity by raising the voices of less powerful entities and elevating those voices so that they can be heard. So I think philanthropy is critically important, and not just to compliment Robert Johnson as a grantee, but Robert Johnson Foundation has been, I think, particularly strong and effective at using its ability to influence the society.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So sad. I mean, that time, I know. I guess I'll just say, I mean, I feel like what we've been talking about up here is power, right? And we all have power, whether it's from a philanthropic perspective, from an academic perspective, from a community-based organization perspective, from an individual researcher perspective. At our table, we had people from all different kinds of industries, right? But we all have power. So how do we look? How do we use our voice in a powerful way? Jaboa's comments at the beginning were really all about organizing. We all have the power to organize in very different ways. And so I hope maybe with this very brief conversation, what we're leaving you with is this idea of using your voice, your platform, because each of us has one, to think about power shifting and power building and organizing in whatever spaces we're operating in. So I hope that you're left with that, and that, you know, kind of take that idea into the World Cafe that we're gonna, well, no, we already did the World Cafe. We'll take that into whatever is coming this afternoon in the breakout sessions. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over.
We have time for about maybe two questions from the
questions, okay.
audience. So does anybody want to ask a question of our esteemed
Questions, or
panelists?
if anyone
Or
wants to
statements,
answer.
comments? Yeah.
Yeah. Don't be shy.
Anyone feeling brave? Yeah.
Thank you for this panel and for convening us all. I have a question about the recommendation about sort of grasping institutional power where you have it. So my understanding as someone who is not in a position of power in my institution, that once you have those positions of power, then there are other forces that push against you in the other direction. And I've seen people achieve these positions of power where they could make big changes, and those other forces push back in ways that no change happens. So do you have recommendations for how to address those kinds of issues that arise?
Well, certainly that happens, but it also happens when you're not in a position of power, right? There are also going to be forces pushing against you. So that's no different. So that shouldn't be the reason not to go into those positions, right? So those forces are going to come against you, and you have to be strategic and you have to be tactical. And strategy and tactic are different things. You know, a strategy is your overall goal. The tactic are the different activities you engage in to advance the strategy. You need to always be strategic. And so I understand that I am the dean of a independent private institution in a red state, right? And so but I'm also part of an institution that's the biggest employer in the largest city that's the economic engine of that state. So if I'm talking to the governor or someone or a policymaker from Louisiana, you know, what's my conversation going to be? We need to increase the diversity of our student body because of, well, my argument is going to be because we have a 35% Black population in this state, right? We need to build a workforce that can sustain a strong economy for the state. We're an important part of the economic engine that fuels this state. So you must allow us to compete globally. We're a global university, and we're competing against universities all over the world. And you can't hamstring us with policies that make us unable to compete and not be the economic engine that we can be. Now, I just made an argument about health equity just now, whether you recognize it as that or not. But that's the way you make that argument. And those are the conversations that you have. So you're going to be in a position, there are going to be people going to come at you, and you're going to have to be able to respond to that. You're going to have the courage to respond to that. You're going to have to also be willing to get fired or to quit if that is necessary. That's always on the table as an option. But that's how you address that. But the way you address it is to not go into those roles. because you're going to get the pushback whether you're in that role anyway. So better you be in that position where you at least have an opportunity to have a voice, to be a seat at the table. And since I have the microphone, let me one more statement here about the issue, because an issue that comes up often with this is the issue of tokenism. You're the token, you're the one. You know what? I never think about that. I am often the one black guy in the room. That's often the case. And you know what? If I walk in the room and I'm the one black guy, that's not my fault, because I didn't create that room. But when I walk out of the room, if there's nobody left in that room when I walk out, that is my fault, right? So don't worry about being the first or the token or whatever. Worry about impact. Worry about how you can use whatever opportunity you have to wield whatever power you get. How can I use that to advance the agenda that I think is important? And how can I also use that to bring up another generation of people behind me so that there are other people in the room so it doesn't all fall on my shoulders and I'm not a token?
Just to piggyback on that, this idea of tokenism, I think it's a mind shift, right? Because many of us, well, I don't want to speak for other people. I've been in many spaces where I have felt like a token. Right now, I'm chair of the Academic Senate for the entire UC Berkeley campus, right? It's over 1,500 faculty members, 2,000 something faculty members on our campus. And in, I think, 22, 23, we celebrated 60 years of the Academic Senate on our campus. And in those 60 years, and of 46 Academic Senate chairs, there had been 2 people of color to serve as chairs, 4%. 4% people of color. So when I got asked to serve in this role, I was kind of like, why am I being asked? And then I was like, well, I might not ever get asked again, so let me take this chance and let me do whatever I can, right? And my goal is for the Senate to be different when I leave, different than when I got there. So I absolutely agree with you. I'm gonna use every ounce, I'm gonna squeeze every juice out of this berry that I can and hope that I leave a mark and that the Senate will be different moving forward, right? Because you cannot have excellence without diversity. And I don't mean just numeric diversity. I mean real thoughts and insights and practices and ways of thinking, right? But then there was a time where I wasn't in a position like this, and I was a faculty member, had no power, had no voice. Am I going to get tenure? Who knows? But there are some things that we care about as faculty of color. But nobody was going to listen to Amani. Nobody cares what Amani thinks about. But when I go and get with the 5 other people that aren't all people of color, it might also be allies. And when we bring our voices together and then stand up collectively and have a collective voice, then, oh, all of a sudden now you want to pay attention. And then there's not any one individual of us that is bearing the risk, right? Like if you're going to target us, you have to target all of us. So we're all bearing the risk together. So I do believe that there is a way to make change, whether you're in a position with a title or not, right? And it's just a matter of figuring out what that looks like from where you sit. And I really appreciate that question, because it's a hard thing to know what to do, but I think that there's power in numbers and there's power in collectivism. You were pointing.
We have one more question and then we'll wrap up.
So I'll try to build on some of the things you just said, because in Greensboro, I'm sort of the everyone's favorite or unfavorite Asian to be in the room, and sometimes the only one.
Favorite.
But to the point about, I think some things that struck me talking about power, and from the foundation standpoint, maybe unrealized power, and particularly in the time of Trump now, because Trump has won, and the likelihood, maybe this is too much of a guess, that federal funding will be cut all over the place, maybe putting pressures on private foundations to do more, and to realize more of their powers, maybe as a platform and so on. I'll speaking from the community perspective, my experience has been when a comparable Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, in our area, dropped a hunk of money on these teeny weeny communities that I work with, everyone became our friend. Everyone wanted to know, because we were these communities were getting zero respect. And so I simply throw that out as a, however you want to call this, as a secondary effect, as a ripple effect. But we've seen that consistently, that is a kind of transformational change. Never got any recognition before. And suddenly, I mean, this is relatively small amounts of money in the world of funding, 100,000. But we made sure we put a big PR thing out, blah, 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 blah. And it radically changed the environment. And I'll just end it with this. The executive director of this rinky-dink organization was suddenly in the governor's mansion, receiving one of the 4 national awards the following year or so. And that's what it did. And, for better or worse, whatever the politics you want to read, that was big change. So I hope that maybe this unrealized power that foundations have can be more fully realized.
No, and I'll just say quickly, absolutely, which is why I think that what we fund absolutely matters. And it is also why I do think that the foundations, RWJF's shift over time to do more community power type funding, which is again fairly new, is really important, because we have invested large, very, very like millions of dollars in many institutions in our over 50-year history that have had no focus on equity, right? So a lot of the newer work in the last 5 years, the goal is to shift more and more into power building, because that's absolutely where I think we can make the biggest difference. And I will say that for that kind of change to happen, to build on a point that was made earlier, there are accountable, but oppositional authority in an institution absolutely matters. And there are ways to influence change at every level of the foundation. I mean, it is a lot of the changes I have seen at RWJF have come very often from bottom up and through collective action. Program officers on a daily basis make decisions about who a grant goes to, right? So I think we all have to identify places where we can influence, grab the opportunities where we are able to make even more of an influence, but we have to believe that we can be accountable gatekeepers, especially in these institutions at every level.
Well, thank you. I think that ends it for our panel. Thank you both.
Yeah.
And thank all of you. And
Thank you so much.
As we leave the stage, I just wanted to say I'm sitting at this table right here, so the screen is in my view, and I've been mesmerized by the art the whole day. So can we give it up for our artists?
Yeah. Thank you, Riley. All right. Well, I couldn't have dreamt up a better conversation to officially culminate the Ways of Knowing Symposia, as we talk about collectively how we can use our power and voice to shift systems. This has been an extraordinary honor to be a part of. I feel eternally grateful to be in this space and to have connected with so many people over this Ways of Knowing Symposia. I don't know how many of you in the room have ever planned events, but it is no easy feat, especially to do 5 in-person events in 1 year. And so I would be remiss if I didn't take a few moments right now just to thank so many people who made this symposia happen. Thank you to Claire, our program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Omar, Greta, and Tom at Partners for Advancing Health Equity. You really live up to your name. You've been truly incredible, phenomenal partners to go along this journey with. Thank you so, so much. The entire Evidence for Action team, who all were instrumental in some ways in making this a success. Especially want to thank Amani and Aaron for your brilliance, your guidance, and your vision throughout this process. You're amazing. To Steph Chernitsky, who wore a million different hats. Lucinda Benjamin, a lot of their work often goes unnoticed, but without them, we wouldn't be here today. And I want to thank our meeting planner extraordinaire, Kristen Pritchard, who I don't see in the room, but if you see her, please thank her. She was really the only voice of reason when we started out and told her we wanted to do 5 events in 1 year. And she was like, that's insane. And she was right, it was insane, but we made it here and we wouldn't be here without her. So make sure you thank her. I also want to thank all of our co-organizers, Joe, Melissa, Paige, Kanga, Charisse, Joy, Melody, Adolfo, Burt, and all of our thought partners, Dr. Curtis, Sarah, and Jaboa. Thank you for all your time, energy, and expertise in planning these events. And I want to thank the rest of the E4A team, Janae, Alyssa, Yaji, and Jennifer for all of your support throughout all of this. Want to make sure you're named as well. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you, all of our symposia participants. There's Kristen. She just came in the back. So Kristen, thank you so much. I want to thank our symposia participants, all of you who are in the room today, all of those who joined us virtually, everyone who came to all of our events. You've been doing this work for a really, really long time, and you showed up, you were engaged, you were enthusiastic, you challenged each other, and you all helped to, generate enthusiasm for how we can move this work forward. And so just really eternally grateful to you all. And I think on behalf of the entire organizing committee, we just want to express our deep gratitude for you all. When we started out on this process, a lot of people were like, what is the Ways of Knowing Symposia? Like, what are you doing? And a lot of times we didn't really know exactly where this journey would go, but we knew if we led with values, we'd figure it out together. And so we're just so glad that you all came along this journey with us. And we hope that you'll continue this journey. The work is really just beginning, as we've heard a lot today. So we're not going away, and we hope you don't either. We hope that you'll continue to engage with us as we go along this journey. And so I just have a few quick notes before we wrap up. And thank you to our virtual audience who stuck with us through this whole day. Just a few things that came up that I want to make sure we note before we officially wrap. So some of the participants who were at the Community Ways of Knowing event have started an affinity group to continue that conversation, and they invite all of you to be part of that if you're interested. They meet once a month, and we'll send out information about that if you're interested in joining. Also, Annie, I think, informed us that if you don't want to read Project 2025, you can look at a graphic of it at stopproject2025.org. So if you don't want to read it, you can view the graphic, and we'll also send this out as well. And we'll be sending out a lot of different information and materials to anybody who registered today. So you'll get the amazing illustrated graphic notes, and we're going to assess the quality of the recording and make sure it's good to go to send out, just given our technical difficulties today, but you'll likely get that if it's good. And we will continue to send more information as we engage in this work moving forward. And so feel free to opt out if you don't want to hear from us, but otherwise you likely will. Is there anything I'm missing to? Okay, we'll break for lunch, and don't go anywhere. For those of you in person, we have some really amazing breakout sessions planned, so we hope you'll join us for that, and we'll let you know where each of those will be happening, because there'll be 3 different rooms. But right now, just thank you so much for being here, and let's go to lunch.